We have two presenters today to finish out our 2018 DHSI panel series. It's going to be Megan Stowe and Bianca Hernandez. I'm going to introduce them one at a time. They're going to present, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for questions, and then presenter. So we're going to start with Megan Stowe. Megan is a doctoral candidate in the Department of English. Her work focuses on representations of climate change and its impact on marginalized communities in transnational advocacy literature. Currently, she teaches 20th century British literature at USS St. Pete and is a full-time academic advisor in the Department of Chemistry for Biomedical Sciences. So please give a warm welcome. So the panel that the class that I participated in at DHSI 2018 at the University of Victoria was intersectional feminist digital humanities, theoretical, social, and material engagements. And one of the most important things that I took away from it was the collectivity of the feminist movement and how it is sometimes erased or siloed on the internet and in academy. And so #FemDH is the title of my talk because a lot of the information that I got had to be mined through resources like Twitter and academic Tumblr and things like that, in addition to the course reviews that we went over, in order for me to take the theoretical framework for a feminist DH and make it applicable, which I think is really important, in our actual teaching and activism in and outside of academy. So Anne Conwen and Liz Lush were the professors who taught the course, and I thought I would show you just a brief part of the course description for it so that everyone sort of has some background understanding of why FemDH and what we're doing in FemDH. So there's a deep history of feminist engagement with technology. Projects like FemTechNet, which Anne was a huge part of, argue that this history is often hidden and that feminist thinkers are frequently siloed. This was evident even at DHSI because a lot of the courses that were on offer were very much tool-oriented and weren't including any integrated discussion of either feminist thinking or attention to race and diversity. So it was sort of like, hey, come to DHSI, take this class, learn how to use Voyant or do text mining, and we're not going to talk about the history of segregated race and siloing of feminist thinking that has imbued all of these practices, right? And so there's a separate category for teaching feminist DH and a separate category, which Bianca will talk about later, for teaching race in DH, instead of integrating those materials in the same way that I think we sometimes see in academy, where we have 20th century literature and those courses don't often include literature of color. So there's this default setting where Hemingway and Faulkner are 20th century American, but we're not teaching, for example, Chicano or Chicana texts in those courses that absolutely are American literature. There has to be a separate course for that. There's African American literature, there's Chicano literature, but there's not an integration of those ideas into this whole part. And so this is just a smaller sort of recognition of something that's happening largely in our disciplines and something that feminist DH is trying to point to say, listen, if we're going to show how the academy is really crucial to a humanism, to our contemporary political moment, to this idea that's happening around the nation where we're getting rid of academic departments that teach humanities courses, and particularly literature and red comp and creative writing courses, then we need to become interdisciplinary. We need to show how we are already multidisciplinary, and we need to incorporate ideas of feminist thinking and an attention to the inclusivity that we often say we are doing and put it into real praxis. So this course helped me to think about that, particularly because one of the things that we talked about in doing DH in the classroom is this assumption that there is a value or efficacy of specific digital tools that often students of color can't afford. Or students from low socioeconomic backgrounds from places like the Panhandle also can't afford or access. And here we're standing in this beautiful lab that is open access to many people, but lots of people don't know about it, and many professors are not using this technology in their classes, and when they are, it's sometimes difficult for students to relate to how these tools are being used and why we're using them. So FemTechNet has a manifesto online. FemTechNet is a cooperative, a collective of feminist thinkers who have been using digital tools and doing digital humanities for a very long time. They came together to form a community where they could take that siloing and become part of the larger conversation on digital technologies and reveal how they have been doing this work, how women and people of color have been doing this work for a long time and just sometimes are not recognized, largely because the field of DH has often been very white and very male, as is unfortunately academy in most cases. So FemTechNet's manifesto, I just wanted you to see some of the key ideas that I took away that I like to incorporate in my classroom practices for digital technologies so that students are not A, intimidated by the technology itself, not using the technology just for the sake of incorporating a technological practice, and getting real value and real life applicability from the sorts of projects that we're doing in class. So to sum that up, I just don't want to use a tool in class for the sake of doing DH. That's not really DH. Anyone can use tools, but we want to talk about why these tools are important and how they further the knowledge of students and the collaborative work of students, especially in my literature classes, who often don't do collaborative work because, unfortunately, in graduate school and at the professoriate level, collaborative articles are not given the same sort of weight as a single author paper, which is not always true in RetComp, where sometimes they value and are valued for their collaborativity a bit more. So FemTechNet wants to highlight creating better tools for doing the kind of work that we're doing. Collectivity is part of the feminist technology. Collaboration is a part of the feminist technology. We're also accountable to each other for the work that we do. We use divergent values and cultural, that we understand that complex systems have divergent values and cultural assumptions attached to them, so that sometimes we say, oh, our students are digital natives, but they're not really. They don't know how to use tools like Voyage or even Microsoft Word sometimes. They're social media natives, and they can do those types of things with ease, sometimes better ease than some older millennials, but they don't necessarily know how to use programs that they will need to use in the workplace. And so it's important to recognize that we can't make these assumptions about our students who often haven't even seen some of the technologies that we're using or haven't had, in some cases, internet access. So this top part over here is really important to me. FemTechNet is fueled by our civil rights, anti-racist, queer, decolonizing, trans-feminist pedagogies as we work within the Valley of the Beast of neoliberal austerity, normalized precarity, neo-colonial techno, missionary evangelism, and MOOC fever towards the radical redistribution, reinvention, and repurposing of technological, material, emotional, academic, and monetary resources, which is a mouthful, right? But essentially it's saying our feminist technology in digital humanities needs to be inclusive and representative of the larger Americas. And in that way, feminist digital humanities is purposely political. And from that political moment, we got #TransformDH, among other hashtag activist symbols that showed up on places like Twitter, Tumblr, even Facebook, in order to call attention to the fact that DH was not accurately representing the history of feminist thinkers, women queer people and folks of color in its practices in the academy. So when we think about how to transform DH from a feminist perspective, we need to address questions of race, class, gender, sexuality, and disability and make them central to our DH arguments. So before I was talking about how I don't like to use a tool in a course just for the sake of saying, oh, we're doing DH in this course. Instead, I want to think about how I can use this tool to elucidate for my students the types of problems that we're seeing in contemporary America when I'm teaching literature. And so if I'm doing a project like I did a few semesters ago, and we're making comics online, we're reading comic books like Octavia Butler's Kindred, or my favorite thing is Monsters, which talks about disability. Kindred talks about the history of racism and what it means to be Black in American society. With that history that is sometimes covered up and thought of as way back then and somehow not affecting contemporary culture, I want to make sure that these are questions that are central to how we use that technology as well. And I found some interesting things when I was doing that project. So we had a large group, 30 students who all worked in groups of 4 or 5 to do comic book representations from the work that they did in a course on cultural monsters in America. And after we read My Favorite Thing is Monsters, even my Latinx students and my Black students were drawing their central characters as white, because they're so used to that being a default setting. And so taking that moment to look at why we had made those cultural assumptions in a course and why students were not seeing themselves in the literature was crucial to our use of representation of those comic book characters that they wrote themselves into in their DH project later. And they ended up being far superior to some projects that I had done where I hadn't made that explicit, because sometimes as a graduate student, and even as a professor, it's an uncomfortable conversation, like a lot of this is. And one of the benefits of being at DHSI and taking this course on feminism was sitting with that discomfort in a group of people who were from completely diverse backgrounds, who sometimes didn't often see eye to eye on things, and figuring out why we're so uncomfortable about these conversations, how to use that discomfort to work through and make progress together as a collective. So what does that look like in practice if I'm saying feminist DH is political, it's something where we need to take measure of our contemporary historical and cultural moment? If I'm saying the default setting for a lot of our literature courses, some of our Red Comp courses, some of our creative writing courses are default using white authors and not necessarily inclusive. If I'm saying that largely in academy we have an issue, and particularly sometimes in our department, retaining Black graduate students, recruiting Latinx graduate students, and offering courses that take those areas of concern into the American or even the British post-colonial realms and teaching those things alongside of each other as one holistic way of looking at the world, then how do we do this in our classrooms? And I was lucky enough to attend an amazing panel at the Society for the Study of American Women Writers, where 3 Chicana activists, who are also 1 graduate student and 2 tenured university professors, are doing this amazing digital humanities project that has turned into 120 projects across the span of several universities, utilizing graduate students and faculty with absolutely no one in charge. There's no hierarchy there. Everyone's just sort of working alongside each other. It's interdisciplinary, and it is doing this work where it addresses a particular cultural moment in a way that is applicable for literary studies, rhetoric and composition, professional and technical writing, any sort of humanities and creative writing. And what they're doing is they're looking at recovering the history of Hispanic American writing that has come from both sides of the border before, during, and after the Mexican American War. And so there's a, hey, what happened? I knew that this would happen at least once. Excuse me. Bless you. Let's do it this way. So this is an article that talks about some of the work that's being done. It's an interview with Rubika Rassam, who is in charge of a project called Chicana por Mi Raza, which I'll show you in just a moment. And it talks about how we can use digital humanities to address Trump's zero tolerance policy at the border, uncovering the living border that has been a huge topic of conversation, not just in this administration, but for a long time, and has connoted some really awful things about our immigration policy and people coming into the border. But what we don't realize, because we hear it talked about as a static border, is that it's a really living community where people are transnational and crossing borders all the time and contributing financially to the development of both sides of the border. And so this is one of the projects that I thought has been really valuable and something that we can use as a sort of heuristic for how we might incorporate digital technologies and projects, or make them in our own courses in a way that effectively helps students become aware of and stewards of their own communities. This is bacartography.org, or Borderlands Archives Cartography. This is Mayra Alvarez and Sylvia Fernandez, one graduate student and one professor, and they have formed United Fronteras. They're both fronterizas, or women who grew up in border culture, living at the border that's very permeable between Mexico and the United States, in different border communities, because often we think of the United States-Mexican border as this one place, and it's not. It's several communities spanning thousands of miles, and very different cultures at touch points of each of those communities. And so these women have collected newspapers and recovered them from before, during, and after the Mexican-American War, and are using those newspapers to show the development of culture that has happened between border regions. So I'm just going to click on that real quick because I want you to see what that looks like and the types of tools that you can use to do that. So we have newspaper exhibits, resources. They're very active on social media. And then I'm going to show you the map, which looks at historical periods and breaks up the distribution of the newspapers that they're doing between those different periods, so that you can see the movement that's happening as politics is creating a difficult scenario for these newspapers, and where people are moving to, and who's supporting those newspapers. And you can see that it's not just at the border that these Mexican, American and Mexican newspaper presses were being run or distributed, but as far north as the Carolinas and as far west as Arizona and California. They also have some exhibitions that they're doing, so it's not just digital workmanship, it's also hosted by a number of museums in the same way that we did some graduate students and I did a DH project. Sorry, it's hard to find where I am here. Thank you. Some graduate students and I did some research on, Jose Iglesias, who was a Cuban-American author, and then built a website for it and talked about the community of immigrants in Ybor and how they shaped the tradition of Latinx heritage in Tampa. And then we took QR codes and put them up in the museum. It's still there now. You're welcome to go see it at the Ybor History Museum. And so you can take a tour through Jose Iglesias' literature during the different time periods in which he was active and see what else was happening in Ybor City during that time. Torn Apart Separados is Ludwika Rassam's project, where she looks at the history. This project is really stunning because it makes me so upset. It looks at the history of Republicans and Democrats in office who have taken money from ICE because ICE contracts out through individual contractors that are not owned by the government and pays basically mercenaries to go and find people and collect them to deport them. And so you can see on this map who in your area has taken money, where they come from, are they Democratic reps or Republican reps, and how much money they have taken. And in some cases, it's like upwards of $1 million. So $1.7 million from this Democrat in South Carolina, a couple $1 million just everywhere. And they track that money and see $280 million. They track that money and see how that money was put to use and how these people have voted in terms of immigration law after they've donated the money. And so how can we use a digital tool like this working alongside the literature that we're teaching, doing autoethnography and autocrittography to write ourselves into these stories, using these tools in a way that demonstrates in rhetoric and composition, making arguments that are either legal or cultural. So digital praxis for a feminist digital humanities it can be in everything we do. It's not track specific and no one gets to own it, right? So that's a really important concept that sometimes in academy we